A mysterious sickness spreads among the girls at a New York high school.
Is it a virus, the fracking wells on their campus, or something in the water?
Or is it all in their heads? We're recapping the podcast Hysterical.
That's on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time. Do you wish that this episode you're listening to now, you could have listened to 5 or 6 days ago?
Absolutely. But, you know, in what world could I ever listen to this episode 5 days ago?
Imagine a world where these recap episodes come out the same day as the preview episodes.
No way.
Yeah, that world exists.
Where?
Online. Patreon.com/SoMuchCrime. So little time. Go over to our Patreon, check it out. You can see all of the early released episodes, the bonus content, the outtakes, all that stuff. You can check it out. You can subscribe, support the show. Patreon.com/SoMuchCrime. So little time.
Thank you. Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Dee.
And I'm Jeff. And before we start today, just a warning.
Warning.
We're going to talk about all of the podcast Hysterical here.
Did you miss our preview from Sunday? If so, go listen to that one first.
You'll also find a link for Hysterical in our show notes here. All right, before we get to our discussion, we just want to remind you of what this podcast is. So Hysterical came out in the summer of 2024. It was put out by Wondery and Pineapple Street Studios. The host is Dan Taberski. There are 7 total episodes. Each one is about 30 to 40 minutes long.
But what is the story about? In episode 1, we heard about the sudden mysterious illness that spread among high school girls in Leroy, New York in 2011. It's similar to Tourette's, including some vocal outbursts, facial tics, and uncontrollable sudden movements. It seemed that people were split. They felt maybe there was some sort of contagion going on, or maybe the girls were all making it up.
All right, Dee, let's get to our discussion. What are your vibes and feelings on this podcast after listening to it all?
I freaking love Dan Taberski.
Why?
Love him. I don't know. I just continue to like him. Like, even at one point, I can't remember, you'll know now what episode this was. He was basically like, sarcastic sociologist coming up. Do you remember that episode?
Yeah, I do.
When they were talking about like the Havana...
Havana syndrome.
Yeah, the Havana syndrome and the other one. Oh, shell shock and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about a sarcastic sociologist, and I just thought that was very funny. I feel like he brought light where light was needed, but he told the story. He didn't insert himself. He wasn't like trying to be a peacock and be like, I do this, I do that, which we've seen a lot with some hosts, where they're like inserting themselves and trying to be more in the story. He had a connection to the town, but he stepped back and let the story tell itself, and I liked that a lot.
Yeah, do you think it helped that no one died in this?
Like, help too.
Well,
the
because
person who didn't die, like
he had a sense of humor, and I thought he did a nice job of kind of keeping a sense of humor, keeping it kind of light. You know, he brought it back to Jello in the end, which I really appreciated.
And the Leroy thing, that's like going like these threads going through the whole thing.
I love a running joke, and that
I
was
love a running joke.
A really good running joke throughout the whole thing. Yeah, I appreciated how he even called out that, yeah, we're still doing this Leroy thing.
Yeah.
that
He's
was
like, yes, I'm still saying it every time I meet someone.
Let me ask you this, though. So 7 episodes, 30 to 40 minutes each. How did you feel about the overall structure of it, like the length of it? I felt like there was a little bit of filler towards the back half of it.
Because we move away from the girls.
Yeah.
We move away from the story of the high school that we hear so much about in episode 1 and episode 2.
Yeah.
And even 3. Yeah, I know what you mean. It kind of brought in these random... They're not random. They are tangents, but are they connected? Like the story of Havana syndrome, and then this idea that there's like an attack on Americans using, what are they called? Microwave guns? Was that what the phrase
Something
was
like
called?
that, yeah.
I was like, okay, but is this the same? And then the fentanyl thing. But then I think the point is, like the Leroy story, is he's trying to weave together that everyone might just be experiencing something because they feel like someone else previously had it. So it's more anxiety, I think, is what they're kind of pointing at, and how your mind can be a very strong leader in symptoms at times, is what they were saying.
Yeah, which I liked. I had heard the Havana syndrome story before. Like, I knew that story well, actually, because that was something that I was sort of fascinated by when that happened. I didn't know the fentanyl thing, like the if you make contact with fentanyl, that some people believe there's a lot of this issue with like cops touching fentanyl and having these severe reactions.
That was wild to me.
Yeah.
Like the story about the attorney and in the courthouse, I felt nervous when they were like playing the tape of what happened. I was like, what is she going to accidentally do?
Yeah, the Annika Collins, the lawyer who had the fentanyl thing in the court, what I don't understand, and I guess this is, if I have a gripe, and I overall...
Such a deadly name, sorry. Annika.
It's a good name.
It's a good name.
I did actually think this was a really well-made podcast, and I did enjoy it. But I felt like some of the construction of the series and some of the episodes were a little deceptive in a way that I didn't like. That one in particular, that one more than any other, I think, because it was basically presented as Annika is in court, she's arguing a case, and she succumbs to this like fentanyl-induced reaction where there's this severe reaction. And then we get the whole bit about how this whole fentanyl thing may be some type of psychological thing, this made-up thing, this type of conversion disorder. But we never really hear... I don't feel like we ever really get her whole story of like, she must have then known about this thing with fentanyl, because we hear about that with the cops, where the cops, all their body cam footage shows them having these reactions. And so that sort of feeds onto itself. But we don't get that about Annika. Like, we don't hear about how she must have known this fentanyl thing. Otherwise, the whole conversion disorder thing doesn't make sense, does it? Like, you can't have the reaction if you don't know that the reaction is the thing that people think happens.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't think that they really ever dive into that enough. They just basically say she was called a liar, and then she rings up the... Anyway. Yes, I agree.
Okay. Okay.
No, but it was interesting because when I was listening to that, I was like, okay, so that we're saying she had a fentanyl overdose and they're giving her Narcan and whatever. But the paramedics and the people in the hospital had said like, oh, that's definitely an opioid overdose that night or that day. And then after, everyone who knows anything about opioids is like, well, sure, an opioid slows down your heart rate and whatever. So why would it be opioid overdose? And I'm like, well, why then did the hospital and the paramedics straight away assume it must be an opioid overdose? Like, I don't understand that part, because they're also trained. Like, they know this stuff. So where's the link there? I feel like we never get closure on that part of it. And then also we don't get to come back to like, yeah, as you said, like, did she know about, like, presumably she did.
She must have.
If she's an attorney and she's working a lot of drug cases, she's going to know about some issue that's coming up with the cops, like.
But I do think, so one of the things that I think, to get back to your point about Dan Taberski and I think a relatively good job he did of kind of constructing the story from these different parts and keeping coming back to things. To me, this reinforces something that I already believed, which is this sort of like mind over matter, the placebo effect or the nocebo effect, which is a term that I did not know of. You can essentially, like, the brain can make you manifest physical symptoms out of sort of nothing. And how do you feel about that as like a concept?
As in, do I believe that it's true?
Yeah.
I mean, like, I do. I believe that the brain has the ability to take, like, you can really think yourself into a stupor. I really do believe that. What I find hard is, for the majority of these cases that we heard about, we're talking about women here.
Sure.
And I suppose the facts are, there has not been enough or half as much money and time and research gone into women's bodies from a medical point of view, not from other points of view.
Other points of view, sure.
Like there hasn't been in comparison to men's, and I feel like there's a chance that, you know, in 50, hopefully shorter than that, 50 years time, they could be like, oh, there's this whole other facet of women that we've never really realized, and like how their hormones react, blah blah blah, this that, and the other. Like we just don't know, because the people haven't looked into it.
Sure.
They haven't researched them as much as they say men's bodies have. And also pain with women is so often dismissed. Even like the most basic and common pains for women are dismissed. Like when you look at recently there's talk in the UK and Ireland about giving like period days or menstrual cycle days, or I don't know what they're calling them, to women who are experiencing severe symptoms that so severe that they're debilitated. And then there's like this counter argument about like, oh, well, maybe they might take advantage of this because, you know, who could trust a woman? All of this makes me really hesitant to say, do I believe in general the mind is really powerful? I absolutely do. I think the mind is like, you really have to take care of it for your body, for your motivation, for every part of you. And I believe that it can manifest things in your heart and in your soul and in your body to some extent. But I think the some extent has to be understood here. And like what we were talking about in the first episode was like all of these girls, and like they had legitimate reasons to be anxious if there's goo seeping up from the fields where they're practicing on. Like we don't go into that enough. The school have something to answer for, and the city that they're living in, not to like address it, to be like trying to brush it under the carpet, that there's these like canisters of like fluids seeping into the soil, and like, don't worry about that, it's fine. Like,
yeah,
this is wild. Would you be saying this is fine if all of the top football players at your school were down with something like this?
It's a great question. I actually, that was something that I felt was, I walked away from this a little like wanting of, okay, so I understand that they tested the water in the school. They tested. They said they did, yeah.
They said they did, yeah.
Okay. They said they did. They, the Erin Brokovich's second in command came and tried to find something, and Erin Brokovich seemed to be convinced. But they also basically said, we can't find anything conclusive, and they walked away. I find it hard to believe that these barrels of toxic waste that were sitting out in the woods didn't leak into the ground or the groundwater. That's baffling to me. I also, that the fact that there was these fracking wells on the school. So when I used to live in Colorado, it was during the fracking boom in Colorado, and they were trying real hard, the oil industry, to put fracking wells on school grounds. And they passed a law while we lived in the town we lived in, where you couldn't have them on the school grounds. So they were just on the other side of the fence. And so we did a lot of reading at the time about fracking because it was new to us. This is going back to actually around this time, 2011. And I know it sounds crazy. I don't trust the oil and gas industry that's pumping these chemicals into the ground to break up the rock to get the oil out of it. Seems a little shady. They don't seem to really know what they're doing. There also were in Colorado where we lived some accidents where some of those chemicals would spill. But those are the ones that they had on the surface. We can't tell what they're doing below ground. It's got to be getting into the water. So anyway, so there's all those things together, and then also there's the train derailment. There's the Jello factory. Who knows what was coming out of the Jello factory? And then the fracking
mayonnaise,
wells.
maybe.
Mayonnaise. I find it hard to believe that the water is clean, that the sports fields are safe. Maybe they are, but enough questions were raised that I definitely was suspicious of that.
Yeah, it all spoke, and like I felt like maybe you're right. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe I feel like the middle couple of episodes just went off track. When we got to was it the final episode or the second to last episode with Rose?
That was
Is
the
it
final
Rose?
episode, yeah, Rose. Rose's
Oh
story.
my gosh.
Yeah.
Rose's story. Like which none of the other girls or students kind of either we just don't hear about in episode 1 and episode 2. But she gets put off. Because she was patient 0 or whatever. She had been diagnosed with Tourette's before this. It was nothing to do with this whole outbreak. But people were like, oh, they're getting it because of you. And then they put her, like, make her do her classes in, like, the sound booth beside the auditorium. And apparently some adult in the school said the needs of many outweigh the needs of the few.
Yeah.
Imagine as a teenage girl hearing that. Not even like 13, 14.
I will say this. I meant to bring this up in our preview episode, and I forgot. The high school I taught at, there was a boy with Tourette's. And I will always remember this. I think he was the only person I've ever known who had Tourette's that I spent a significant amount of time around. And in this case, it was boys. The other boys in classes in the dining hall with him would mimic his outbursts.
Like taking the piss.
I don't really know what that phrase means.
Oh, sorry. Like kind of slagging him.
Yeah. Sort of. I think they also saw it as an opportunity to just shout profanity out of nowhere as like a 15, 16, 17-year-old boy of like, I can get away with this. He can do it. I'm going to do it too. And not realizing, I think Rose presents this really well of she can't control this. This is something she has lived with her whole life. She will live with her whole life. And yeah, this is cruel. In a way that teenagers are certainly often cruel to each other, but well,
I mean, the other teens, like when they did get over it, and by the sounds of it, they all did. They just get to go on with their real life, whereas like Rose is still dealing with this, going to camp every year.
Yeah, the camp sounds.
I know,
amazing.
She's
Her
like,
attitude.
It's the best time ever. Like we all just get to be together, and it's wild. It's chaotic. Everyone's like shouting and screaming and twitching. And I was like, oh my God. Maybe I think Rose might need, if she's 21, I think Rose needs to go on our list of people we should go for a drink with.
Yeah. Oh, she should be now because this happened all 14 years ago. So.
Oh, that's true.
She must be.
Had you ever heard of conversion disorder?
I don't know that I knew the term. I definitely have heard. This is like yes, I'd heard of this thing happening.
Scenario, like.
Well, because I'd read a lot about Havana syndrome when this happened to the Americans in Cuba. I'd also, like, this comes up in so many different places. I mean, it's the yips in sports, baseball specifically. Have you heard of the yips?
No.
So it's a silly name. The yips is, and this, I guess this maybe happens in other sports. I feel like it comes up, I hear it all the time about it with baseball players, where they sort of like lose their basic motor skills. You forget how to throw a baseball, and you just pick up the baseball and you just like your arm flops down, or you just throw it wildly into the stands. It's like fundamental things that you've done a million times for, since you were a kid. You suddenly just like something snaps in your brain and you just can't do it. And they call it the yips. And it's debilitating because
it's like choking. Is that like a thing in?
But it's not
basketball?
In the moment. It's more like a psychological thing that lasts for days, weeks, months.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Maybe they're like, I need a break. You guys play far too often. Maybe that's just what the yips are.
But this was my point about like, sure. I think
the way sometimes you just start another sentence and you're like, I'm just going to ignore what she said there. I'm just going to keep going.
Just got to keep the train moving.
Yeah.
But I think there are so many examples of this. Had you heard of this before?
Not really, no. But then when they were comparing it to yawning, I was like, oh yeah. Like that's like a version of this. And like even Rose was saying, when at the camp when all the kids get together, or the camp goers get together, teenagers or whatever, who all have Tourette's, like their tics get louder and like they start to tick shop, yeah, fascinating. I need a whole podcast on that. So yeah, like as in that kind of way, and like it wasn't a shock to me. What I feel like was a shock is like we're talking about so many different words here. It's like we're using synonyms all over the shop in this podcast. And it was said so many times, like someone called it the H word.
Yeah.
And like we're talking about hysteria. It's just like the power of this word, because like it brings up so much, and it's so much like history. There's so much of a negative connotation to it, specifically obviously with women. And like, because even with the Salem Witch Trials, like they were talking about, you obviously knew this, Davin, what's it called now?
Danvers.
Used to be Salem.
Danvers.
Danvers. Yeah, like I never knew that they changed their name. That's wild.
That was a little deceptive, because Salem, Massachusetts is still a town in north of Boston, and really Danvers is the town next to it, and they just kind of split it in two, and one kept the name Salem and one got the name Danvers. So that, I feel like that was a little, as a person who's lived in Massachusetts, like that's he was kind of misleading us a little in an innocent way. Like it doesn't really matter, but
interesting. But I just thought the power of the word is so interesting, because I don't know, I don't know, I feel like words are so interesting. Maybe to me, I feel like a lot since I've moved here, because there's been numerous times I've said words here and realized from people's reactions that they have a very different connotation here.
Sure.
To how we refer to them at home. Like really innocent words, not like, a slag or whatever, which it has happened before when words I would use very often with like slagging people, I don't realize like maybe the history or the origin of them. And like in Ireland, we don't care, or we're ignorant, maybe, I don't know. But like words like very, and I obviously I'm not going to use them now, but very basic words.
Tell us a list of words that you've learned are offensive to Americans.
And I would say them, and people, you being one of these people, has been like, don't say that word. That word means blah. And I'm like, oh, at home it means blah blah blah. And I suppose it's just the power of the word and how everyone can have like a different like reaction to it, because obviously hysteria is something I'd heard of before, but hysterical as a term is something like I know I think I mentioned this in episode 1. A former boss of mine used to say it was hysterical, like just, you know, when you actually completely lose the plot and you can't like contain yourself because something is so funny. And that's where my mind goes with this. It doesn't go to this like negative vibe connotation, which is what we're getting from this podcast. I
do think the word hysterical, like I appreciated the historical context of like 1890s France and Sigmund Freud and the sort of history of women not being listened to, and you know, also the correlation or the connection with like hysterectomies and that, like all of that historical context that I appreciate that this included. One thing I wanted to ask you related to this, because you were talking about like if you're these girls and you basically get told it's all in your head, or you're being hysterical, or there's this conversion disorder thing that you've never heard.
Calm down.
Yeah, you're being told that you're making, in a way, you're
goes
making
over
this up.
real well if you tell someone to calm down.
Sure. One thing I was thinking about was this story. Episode 1 opened with that, I think, unnamed girl who wasn't in Leroy or Lori, who posted her video on YouTube where she was talking about her symptoms. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
She posted that video in December of 2011. But these symptoms started happening in the fall, earlier than that. He didn't call attention to that, but that girl's video came after this had become a news story.
Did you go back and fact check that?
I did go back and fact check that, yes.
Whoa.
But what that makes me think, so regardless of how that was, I think, a little bit sort of manipulative, whatever, it worked for the podcast.
The kind of mistrust going on there, though.
A little bit. But something he didn't, I think he mentioned, but maybe didn't spend a lot of time focusing on is, or he talked about this in the context of the police officers and the body cam footage and the reactions to fentanyl. Isn't that same thing true of like, because you see more of this, it happens more? How is that not like the TikTok, Instagram, YouTube effect of we're just exposed to more of these types of things, therefore more of that might be in our brains, therefore our brains might manifest more of these things out of the ether. You know, I think like what happened in Salem hundreds of years ago, happened in a small isolated community that was kind of cut off from the rest of the world in the way that everybody was kind of cut off from the rest of the world back in that time. But now we're all connected. And if girls at this high school in upstate New York are posting or making the news or going on Dr. Drew, this whole side thing on Dr. Drew.
Bad idea.
Like, I worry that this kind of thing is just going to happen more and more, particularly for people who are susceptible, which everyone is susceptible to this. It's not a gender thing. It's not an age thing. I think it's because we're so connected now, and because the ability to sort of spread these things is so much easier, that if our brains really are susceptible to this conversion disorder of this happened because there was this one theory is this happened because there was this girl with Tourette's who had these symptoms. Other people were exposed to that. They saw that. And then those symptoms manifested themselves in these girls. And it sort of spread like wildfire around this close-knit community of girls in this one school. That is so much easier to spread now because of social media. Would this have spread to other clusters of people in other places like it did in this story pre-internet? I don't think it would have.
No, surely not. If you listen, and now after you calling out fact check on a lot of stuff here, I haven't fact checked these two things. But the story of the sheep walking in the perfect circle and then the other sheep joining them. And then the orca with the fish hat.
The dead seal on its head, yeah.
You know, the internet hasn't got to them.
And no.
But like, is this not also the same as like a fad, like a fashion thing? Like, you know, Crocs were like the devil a few years ago, and then people who are famous wear Crocs, and like everyone all of a sudden is like, look at my Crocs. Lots of people are not, but a lot of people are.
Right, but let's talk about the orca example, because that was fascinating. So,
but that's the same thing.
It is the same thing.
That's a fashion fad, but but
that's my point.
And also with a hat, with a fish, with like an animal.
You say a fashion fad in the sea? Yeah. It is a fashion fad in the sea, but it was one orca, and then several others, and that orca's pod started doing it, and then orcas in neighboring pods off the coast, I think Seattle or Washington, started doing it too. But not orcas in Antarctica, not orcas off the coast of Greenland.
No, because I couldn't see them.
That's my point. Orcas aren't on TikTok, I don't think. Orca TikTok may be a thing. They're very smart.
Orca Talk? Maybe we should set that up.
Orca
Seems
Talk.
Very lucrative.
Why does it have to be their name in it? Like, we don't call it like People Talk. We call it TikTok.
Anyway. Yeah. No, like, I don't know. I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you, but it's like the yawn. If someone in Antarctica yawns, you're not going to be like, oh, I need to yawn. But if someone in the office yawns, or in a meeting you're in, like, you're likely going to yawn as well, or want to yawn. So,
yeah.
I mean, that's all the same. And I just think like teenage years are such an impressionable, weird, gross, I'm sorry people have to go through a time. Yeah. Okay, but Jeff, before we finish up talking about this podcast, there is like one frustration that I have. What's the crime here?
Yeah, you did promise me a crime when you pitched this podcast.
I was promised a crime. This is like going to the library, going to the true crime section, picking up a book and being like, wait a second.
But
I read 372 pages.
You really like this podcast.
I mean, I did. Well, I think I liked Dan Taberski until you ruined him for me.
Do you not really like true crime? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, I mean, like, I'm not like, I'm multidimensional. I have likes of many things.
You contain multitudes. Do you think
I have a melange.
So what is the crime?
I can't remember if that was in this podcast. I don't think it was.
That was in Evan Olinsky's
time machine. That made me happy.
What is the crime? I don't know. There isn't really a crime. There's no crime here.
No. Like, I mean, I feel like there's several, but there's none like that are landed on.
There could have been a crime if there was a cover up by the city or the school. Like, there's a lot of people who did some bad things, but nothing seemingly criminal that we know about for sure.
I mean, we went from organs in a black bag and a Corvette to yawning. Contagion.
It is the Christmas season, and maybe after our incredibly dark
Are we trying to be nice?
Well,
Hands up those spirits, guys. That's what you love at Christmas time, is being forced to up your spirits.
I don't know if you remember, but for Thanksgiving we had cannibalism, dismemberment, castration, bondage. Like, we went super dark.
That sounds way more like interesting though than I don't know. Now that I think about it, I'm like, maybe this crime was not worth my time. But then I'd miss out on Dan Taberski and Rose. I liked Rose.
You know what this was, though? In the genre of...
Is this like crime light? L-I-T-E?
Yes. But also, this was a mystery, which I feel like is a subgenre of true crime.
We'll go with that.
I think this, for all the things I have questions about or concerns about the construction of this, I did really enjoy listening to this. I felt like this was worth my time. Also, 7 episodes, 30 or so minutes each. It's pretty quick, pretty enjoyable, easy to follow, good sense of humor, no dismemberment, no...
Did you not miss it, though? You're like, wait a sec, when's someone getting beheaded?
I'm going to tell you what, didn't miss it. Didn't miss the beheadings.
God. It's a sad day. It's so much crime, so little time. If you've enjoyed this podcast, which of course you have, don't forget to share the love on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you got your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram as well. And don't forget to tell people. We are nothing without listeners. So the more you listen, the more we are. And we like being. So do it.
Dee, do you remember where you were when the Broomgate scandal broke?
When the what?
When Broomgate happened.
Okay, sorry. We've had Watergate. Not on this show, but you know, it's been done. We've had Gategate. I've never heard of Broomgate.
So 2015.
Did you forget about Gategate?
I had forgotten about Gate from West Cork. Yeah, the missing gate. In 2015, at the International Grand Slam of Curling in Newfoundland, one of the teams showed up and used... Well, first of all, do you know they use brooms in curling?
Yes.
Do you know how many brooms they use?
5.
2.
Okay.
But a team showed up and they used 1, not 2, which was somehow better? I don't know. Anyway, we're going to listen to a podcast called Broomgate from CBC Podcast and learn all about this massive scandal.
That's on the next So Much Crime.
So Little Time.
So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of MimeGov Media. The executive producer is Paxton Calariso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show in your podcast app. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.